So Dalits are the largest population within the communities discriminated by work and descent. And there is a slogan where we say Jai Bhim. It is in honor of one of the human rights activists and social justice heroes, similar to Martin Luther King in India, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So when I say Jai Bhim, you say Jai Bhim. Jai Bhim. Jai Bhim. So we were thinking about this session to be more, not so much panel, but in terms of why we are here, we would like to also discuss the strategies that we are using as a community discriminated on work and dissent. And how do we move on from here? Also, there are others who are not part of the CDW community who can also give messages of solidarity as to what is it that we can take forward and how is it that you can support the community. We are inspired by the struggles of the indigenous community where they have moved from just being participants and just being at these conferences to having a convention, a declaration on the indigenous people. And we are hoping that in the next few years, we would also be able to achieve some of this. We achieve a convention or a declaration of the people from the communities discriminated by work and descent. So I'd request Paul to just give a little bit of a background of how we've reached here. And then I'd request Durga ji to give a little bit about the Dalit women's demand from this, and what is the intersectionality within the communities discriminated in work and dissent. We have friends from Brazil, we have friends from Romania. Maybe Simona, you can speak first because she needs to go to the UN for the other side event. And I'd also request Robbie. Ingo is here as well. And why we are here. I mean, this is an issue that we've been talking for now almost 75 plus years. And we seem to be, I think, the sixth largest or seventh largest country if we put all this population together in one state. It's a huge population. So, Paul, if you can please come and say a few words.
Just one thing. Okay. It takes 5 minutes. Yes. To have it as a round table.
So I was just inspired by the struggle and the UN and how you were able to get a convention, declaration, sorry, a declaration at the UN. And that is a path that we need to follow as well as the communities discriminated on work and dissent. So if you on that. But before I pass it to Paul, others, also let's say that there's a lot of mentions that we sort of invisible while we are here. Internal civil wars, we have not really spoken about. On where have been slaughtered, more than 500 people have died, which are the official figures. And I think while we are talking about strategies, while we're talking about, I mean, today it was the Christian minority that was killed there. Today it is the Christian minority, tomorrow it will be communities from the discriminated communities based on work and descent, and most of them are the Christian indigenous population from Manipur. So a lot of things like this we have missed, either because of political reasons or because of fear, or because even in India we don't speak about these things. So while we're also talking, we can also mention, because we're among friends, we can mention some of the things that probably we will not dare mention in front of the states or countries, and this is that space. So I'd request Paul, and then maybe Robbie can also speak after Paul, and then we can open the floor.
Thank you. Uh, I hope Carla is not here, because she always threatens me. Oh, she's here. And she says that you have to speak close to the mic, because they're interpreting and there are people on the virtual Zoom who are, but I think the voice is a little loud. I do not know. You may have to reduce the volume. Yeah. Friends, this is a dialogue between similarly excluded communities, but then we all have different forms of exclusion. So actually, for a long time, indigenous and the communities discriminated on work and descent and minorities have been clubbed together. And UN always, even today, UN looks at all these in one: minorities, indigenous, and in the minorities, communities who are internally displaced and internally discriminated and enslaved, not by the North-South colonial discrimination, but this is by our own people, which is a very different form of exclusion from race or the indigeneity, which has been displaced because mostly of the colonial. These are pre-colonial systems. Now, the reason that these communities are invisibilized, also because in each of these continents, the elite are the ones who are responsible for the forms of caste systems that are there in several of these continents. And they would rather talk about the race, because then they can very safely say the North and South. They can say, oh, a different race has occupied us or somebody has displaced us. But to focus on the forms of slavery that we have ourselves inflicted on our own communities is not talked about. It's just pushed under the carpet. And most of the countries, I think only now, recently we see, like in Brazil, like maybe in some other countries, I hope India and several other countries also will come forward. Nepal, to a certain extent, is doing. So we felt that this group, which is looking at indigenous, which is looking at Dalit and other communities like Roma, like Kilambola sisters, and I think we have several of us who are known as Dalits from Nepal and Bangladesh and India are here. So together, I'm sure we have Robbie represents the major group which looking at the whole indigenous movement. And I'm sure there are other colleagues who are also here from the. So would it be possibility to see, one, can we have a dialogue to see how we can learn from each other, number one? And if there are other communities which are interested, what is the ways of solidarity that needs to be exchanged? Then probably there's another thing. I do not know many of you, how many of you have heard about what is the Dalit exclusion that is taking place? What is the Roma communities and their exclusion from Europe and European countries right across from Ireland to Ukraine and Russia, and also communities like Kilambola who have been completely marginalized within their own communities. So it'll be good if we can spend some time in that manner.
Thank you, Paul. I actually forgot to introduce Paul. I don't know, most of you might know, but Paul is the chair of the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent, which is a forum that is bringing together communities discriminated on work and dissent across globally. So you have the Burakumin, like what he said, in Japan, you have the Roma in Europe, Kilambola, Dalits in South Asia, Haratin in Africa, and so forth. So these communities are coming together to form the Global Forum. So I would request maybe Robbie to say a few words, and then Durgaji. We can also bring in the youth. Pradeep, where is it? Okay, youth, and then I would request Simona. Maybe you can go, because you have to go now. Then I'll ask you to say a few words and then leave. She's speaking at the official side event inside the UN. So maybe we will ask you first. Is that okay? Yeah. After Robbie. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the microphone is loud.
Can we further reduce the volume?
Yeah, okay. So,
Sorry? How many people are?
I think 4 or 5.
I think there are 4 to 10 are there. So, yeah.
yeah, I think it's better now. So it was discussed a while ago, no, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that was not handed to us in silver spoon. It was years of struggle from Indigenous peoples when we were not being heard by our governments at the country level. We had to take the struggle to the global level. And with this, it was very, very important that indigenous movements from the different regions came together to really lobby from states to have a declaration that recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples. Now, governments are saying, why do you have special rights? It's not special rights for indigenous peoples, but it's already rights that are existing in international conventions, and it's an affirmation on the historical injustices against indigenous peoples and a recognition of our collective rights. Sadly, though, after the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in 2007, we just had our Indigenous Peoples meeting this morning, realities on the ground didn't change. It's getting worse for many Indigenous communities. Land grabbing, displacement, human rights violation, criminalization, killings of our Indigenous human rights defenders is on the rise. And now with this green transition, this climate, these market-based mechanisms, these climate solutions that they are introducing now is again adding to already a lot of threats in indigenous communities. But a big lesson, or a big in terms of advancing our struggle, it was very, very important to work in solidarity also with other movements. We cannot work in isolation. We can only win if we work together. In the struggle for the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, while indigenous peoples movements from different regions came together, it was also important for us to work with other movements and the civil society in really pushing governments to adopt the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But the work does not end there, because having a declaration or even having a law, in the Philippines, we have a law, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, that recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples. Even with those, there's no assurance that life will be better for people who are left behind, for people who are marginalized. So the struggle still continues for many Indigenous peoples, for local communities, for sectors who are marginalized, including persons with disabilities. No, it's important, even more so at this stage for us to really come together. And these kinds of gathering is important for us to solidify our solidarity with each other, supporting each other's struggles. No, as I emphasized a while ago, we cannot work in isolation in what we are pushing for. We need to work with each other. We may have specific contexts, we may have specific recommendations, we may have specific actions that we want governments to undertake. But at the end of the day, we can only have this if we are together. And for indigenous peoples, we're continuing the struggle for the recognition of our rights. Having a declaration, having a law, as I said, is not an assurance. We need to continue pushing the governments. We need to continue holding them accountable, because if we keep silent after the adoption of these laws, of this declaration, nothing will happen. It will just be on paper. It will just be words. So the work does not end with declaration. The work does not end with policies. The work does not end if they address some of our issues, because it's still a continuing struggle of holding governments accountable to their obligations, especially their human rights obligations. In this discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals, the framework on the human rights-based approach is very much missing. The way that governments are implementing and reporting the Sustainable Development Goals is very much detached to their human rights obligations. And we need to push them to comply with their human rights violation, because only then we can achieve sustainable development. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robbie. I have a question for you, which you don't have to answer it now, but probably later when we are having more discussion, is that you said that even though there's a declaration, life hasn't changed on the ground. So what is it that we can do, having the declaration, and then what is it that we need to do? Should we have sanctions on states? Because we cannot demand sanctions, because then our people will be affected. So what is it that we want to demand at the state level, at the government level, the country level, that yes, you have signed the declaration, but what next? So if you can, we can come back to that question later. I'll request Simona, if you can come and just say a few words. Jeffrey is also here with us, and I have a specific question for you, Jeffrey, which you can also answer later. But think about it, that there's a lot being spoken about the Summit of the Future, but none of us know what it is. So probably you will be the best person to give us or shed some light on what that is, so that we also, because I've asked so many people and everybody seems to be speaking about this one Summit of the Future, but nobody seems to know what exactly it is and what it entails, or what is it? Because if you're talking about another framework, then are we really serious to have another framework? Because if we're not able to implement SDGs, and then having another framework would be quite complicated and complex. So I'd come back to you on that. Simona?
Thank you very much. My name is Simona. I'm Roma from Romania. And I'm representing here the European Roma Grassroots Network organization, which is a coalition of grassroots Roma NGOs across Europe, trying to advocate within the European Union to recognize the Roma as a discriminated group, but also to promote specific Roma inclusion policies. So we are about 12 million Roma in Europe. Some governments are more progressive when it comes to respecting Roma rights and promoting Roma rights, but the situation is not improving, despite the fact that the European Union over the last 2 decades has implemented the so-called European Union integration frameworks, but we see that it's mainly about the political will of national governments. Civil society, it's becoming more and more stronger, especially Roma civil society. That's a lot of hope there, but there's more than that. It's not only about Roma in Europe, but Roma in Latin America, in Brazil. It's a considerable Roma population in North America, in Eastern Europe. But maybe just a bit of background, what are the key challenges that the Roma population is facing, especially in Europe? We see that there are very big human rights violations, to say so. Forced sterilizations are still happening in some countries. Roma children are studying in segregated schools and classes. Roma are evicted from the lands that they have constructed, the so-called illegal houses or barracks. Police brutality, especially after the COVID pandemic, it's happening more and more often. Roma are often criminalized for things that they shouldn't be. So there are a lot of key challenges still to be addressed. And I think with joint forces with GFOD and other communities, just to show that these experiences are not isolated, that we need to act together, as Robbie has said. And it's a common struggle that together we can achieve. Let's hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, and wish you all the best for your side event. Yes.
Just say, what forms of issues, what issues do the people from the Roma community face within the country? You've said it, but is it possible just to give us a little more in terms? Is it land? Is it employment? Is it the children? Something like that. I think it'll be.
Yeah. So as I said, first and foremost, there is a lack of identity documents for Roma, which considerably impacts their access to social services, to property documents, to all sorts of public goods. And also because parents don't have identity documents, their children are most likely to kind of repeat this circle. I mean, we don't have official data about the number of people who don't have IDs, but we see that in many countries, civil society organizations are organizing themselves in order to support this Roma register, to have proper documents. So the phenomenon exists even since the transition to democracy in many Central Eastern European countries. So lack of IDs, that's a key thing. In terms of employability, we have the so-called Fundamental Rights Agency survey in Europe, and they are releasing new data about the situation of Roma in Europe. And we see that employment of Roma is really low compared to the non-Roma in the countries where they live. And this is mainly because of the discrimination that the Roma community is experiencing, including access to education, to quality education, as I said before. The issue of segregated education is still happening. So there is a constant circle of exclusion. So where do Roma work? Well, traditionally, we have been blacksmiths, coppersmiths, artisans, flower sellers, but this type of work has been diminishing or has been wiped out because of the corporations or other industries that don't allow or make it impossible to survive. And we see nowadays that a lot of Roma are working as daily laborers. I mean, I'm not trying to generalize, but we see that this is happening. Waste collectors is a phenomenon that some of the NGOs are trying to link with sustainability and climate change. But honestly, I still feel like we shouldn't reproduce this type of inequalities and promote Roma as waste collectors, because they're exposed to high health risks for themselves and for their families. So access to jobs, it's an issue. We see that there are a lot of European Union programs, national programs that are trying to include Roma on the labor market, but these agencies are failing to reach out to Roma. So it's both because of the attitude of these front office workers that they have towards the Roma, but also a lack of proactive measures or engagement strategies to bring the Roma on the board. Yeah, there are plenty. Yes, for example, I come from Romania. We have specific legislation on anti-gypsies. This was adopted in 2021 in January. But the issue is that nobody knows what this anti-gypsism phenomena means. So it's very difficult to implement this type of law into specific sanctions, to say so. We see discriminatory activities all the time. Most of the Roma are not able to access the justice system. because they don't have knowledge. Again, we go back to the education part. They tend not to report the incidents that are happening to them because they are afraid of retaliation from government or other actors. So they choose in many cases to stay silent. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So from Roma, we'll go back to the Dalit issue. I think we are about 260 million out of that. I'm sure that at least 50% of that are women and young girls. You have a question? Yes.
Thank you for giving me a scoop to speak something about. My name is Uchimong. I'm coming from Bangladesh. I'm belong to Marma community in Chittagong Hill Tracks. We both together from Chittagong Hill Tracks. Just my specific question is, in Bangladesh, in Bangladesh constitution, that denied indigenous terminology in their constitution. They just clearly mentioned that there is no indigenous people in Bangladesh. We have only few small ethnic communities. I don't know what is the differences between the ethnic communities and the indigenous peoples, but in constitution they clearly mention only few indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, not indigenous peoples. Just I want to know to you that in Romania, do you have the constitutional recognition as indigenous people or a specific community like that? Thank you.
Before you answer, can I also ask one question? Because the country that I come from, India, exactly says the same thing. We don't have any indigenous, we have tribes, they say. Yeah, but let me finish. But they're saying, we don't have indigenous, but we only have a few hundred families who are Jews, and they can be called, people of different race, but we do not have indigenous in our country. So this seems to be a pattern which some of these countries are having, not to come under the indigenous identity. This is one thing, but yeah, but same thing.
We don't have any specific provisions about indigenous people, but we see across Europe, like in Romania, we acknowledge all the ethnic groups and minority groups we have, but we see other countries in the constitution, but we see other countries like Bulgaria who is not recognizing that they have a Roma population. So it's nearby country, neighboring country, but they don't recognize the existence of Roma as an ethnic group. So there are some challenges as well, and it's highly political. Yeah.
Thank you. So I will request Durgaji to say a few words about the intersectional aspect within the Dalit community, focusing on Dalit women.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Durga Sup. I am from Nepal. I am a founder and strategic advisor of feminist Dalit organization FEDO. And as well as I am an associate with G4 and ATRF. The women from CDWD, especially Dalit women in South Asia, facing the multiple forms of discrimination and exclusion and many more. The issue when we talk about, we are shouting, we are advocating and talking about the SDG in my country, and I'm one of the advocate to work on SDG issue, focus on Dalit women, and when we have 3 layers of government in Nepal. When you go to the province level and local level government, especially they have to, formulation the law policy program based on SDG, they don't have any information about the SDG, because I'm giving I don't want to say training, but some kinds of training to the local government. When we ask about the international instrument, especially CEDAW, SOR, and SDG, they don't have idea. And how SDG can implement, how SDG can meet in our country without knowing, without addressing the issue of marginalized people, especially on, when we talk about the Dalit women, the Dalit women issue, especially extreme poverty, education, health, violation, gender-based violation, they are facing more than other women, or experiencing more violence than other women, and landless issues, employment issues. There are a number of the issues which they have been facing nowadays. And then even, our community, especially when, there are many, work on SDG, focus on women, but only in general women, they focus on SDG. Within the women, there is the diversity. There is the issue of intersectionality. And when we talk about the diversity, within the diversity also there is the intersectionality issues. Like women with disability, there is also intersectionality issue. Issue of we call it senior citizen or old age people, there is also diverse intersectionality issues. So we are raising that issue at at local level. There is the problem, there is the issues which we have in the ground, which we have dealing day to day. The one thing I would like to share with you, we are able to put the Dalit issue in our constitution. In constitution, we have a provision of the Dalit, special provision of the Dalit. We have an act, Act on Disability, given the Offense and Punishment Act. We have some good program also, planning also for the Dalit. We don't have a specific plan and policy focus on Dalit women, but in general, Dalit have program and policy. But the problem is that there is no implementation at community or in the practical level. So that's why our government just saying, oh, we have a very good constitution, we have a act, and we have a very good policy program, they will say. But in practice, there is the implementation is very weak. So what I would like to give the message to this SDG midpoint events or conference. If we generalize the SDG, we are talking about the leave no one behind. If we generalize it, definitely the discriminated community, especially Dalit and Dalit women, will leave behind. We have to be specific to focus to the Dalit and marginalized women. And we are talking about the CDWD women also, we are working on that issue. And so that's why sometimes what I feel that, the Dalit women issue, Dalit women are not getting enough space to talk and to raise the issue, what they have been facing in ground and what they are facing in practical life. So that's why what Dalit women being facing, the other women are not facing. What Dalit women are facing, other Dalit men are not facing. So that's why they are facing multiple forms of discrimination, caste and gender. Due to the caste and gender discrimination, they're economically, socially, politically, educationally, every sector they are very, very, downtrodden, or they are very much backwarded. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Durgaji. What time are we supposed to end the session? Just at 3. Okay, so we have a little bit more time. Thanks, Carla. So I would just break this and come to Jeffrey, and then I'll come back to Kilambola and Harati, if you can also say, and then we can open the floor for others to also add their comments. Or you can come.
Yeah, why not? Thank you so much. So this is something of a prelude, actually. If you come tomorrow, we're in the session on global democracy in the UN, we'll also be having a little bit of a conversation about the Summit of the Future. But just to give you just a quick introduction to the Coalition for the UN We Need, which is what I represent here. So we're an independent global civil society platforms, and we're dedicated to bringing together CSOs, other stakeholders, the UN member states, to advance follow-up on the UN 75 declaration that was adopted in 2020 on the 75th anniversary of the UN. And one of the outcomes of that declaration was a request that the Secretary General produce a report that would make a number of recommendations to implement the 12 principles of the UN 75 declaration. And that report was Our Common Agenda, which was released the following year in 2021. And in that, in the OCA, there was a suggested roadmap that would include a summit on transforming education, which has already taken place under the aegis of the Secretary General, and a Summit of the Future. The original idea is that the SDG Summit and the Summit of the Future would be taking place this year as twin summits. And then there was another recommendation that there would be a 30th anniversary of the World Social Summit that took place in 1995. So the idea is that there would be a World Social Summit taking place in 2025. So what has happened since then? Well, once member states began to engage, I mean, let's face it, the complexity of the 90 plus recommendations of Our Common Agenda, the G77 in particular really pushed back and said, well, wait a minute, we don't want anything foreshadowing or obscuring the importance of the SDG Summit. So a decision was made to push the Summit of the Future back to 2024. So the idea is that the SDG Summit really focuses on the what needs to be achieved. And the negotiations of the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future, which would be the outcome document of the summit, has really, I think, clarified the notion that the Summit of the Future is really going to be all about the how, focusing on the systemic structural impediments to the implementation of the SDGs. So in that regard, the General Assembly managed to complete a very, I would say, contentious set of negotiations on a draft decision that provides an outline for the scope of the Pact for the Future. And so in terms of a roadmap with regard to our advocacy going forward, once after this SDG Summit, we're looking at basically 5 buckets, if you will, of chapters that will define this Pact for the Future. And these include a chapter on sustainable development and FFD. So you see right there that member states agree that that's a primary focus. These 5 chapters are, I'll just
tell you them right now, but I don't think it's just a coincidence that they rank them in order. One can almost say that there's a ranking here, although they're all interrelated, just as the SDGs are related, right? So following sustainable development and FFD, financing for development, there's international peace and security. And that aligned with that is this idea of a new agenda for peace. Okay. And so there's been a lot of discussion about that, led by the department on peacekeeping and other related departments. And the chapter 3 is on science, technology, innovation, and digital cooperation. And so there's been discussion about the development of a global digital compact that will really seek to address issues regarding AI, the tremendous gap in terms of access to digital, the digital divide, right? Chapter 4 will be a focus on youth and future generations. And there's been an ongoing negotiation of a future generations declaration, which will be annexed to this pact for the future. And then finally, there's a chapter 5 on transforming global governance. So, and there's a whole conversation about the different elements to each of these chapters. So this is the basic roadmap. I mean, we talk about what additional frameworks and whatnot. I think the idea is that the Summit of the Future will seek to, number one, identify those global governance innovations. I mean, there's a whole discussion, right, about the reform of the international financial architecture. I mean, that's going to be a big part of this discussion. So what changes need to occur, what reforms need to occur in the IFIs, in the Bretton Woods institutions, in order for the SDGs to be properly financed. But there are other areas that have assumed tremendous importance in the international community that really we were not entirely aware of in 2015. So like the Global Digital Compact is one such example. There's another chapter of related to transforming global governance, or another element, I should say, on outer space. Well, one could argue, what's the relevance of outer space? It sounds kind of ridiculous, but when you recognize the importance of satellite technology and how we use satellites today to really kind of map out the use of our lands, our forest, agriculture, even settlements, I mean, this all becomes tremendously relevant. So, we live in a complicated world, obviously. The SDGs are complicated, and so we need to really further develop our global institutions together with our regional and national bodies to be able to more effectively deliver on the SDGs. So I think the idea is that the Summit of the Future would be a vehicle, but it is just another stepping stone along the way, right? So we'll have the Summit of the Future next year. Then, of course, the following year would be, let's hope, the conference on financing for development, together with the World Social Summit. They would complement each other very well in that sense. And we continue to move on in that regard. So the final thing is in terms of the work we see for UN, what we were hoping to do, we had a conference this last March called the Global Futures Forum, which we produced an interim PPAF. And it's interim, deliberately defined as such, because it's an ongoing piece of work. And so we really hope to pick up and continue this discussion about further developing our advocacy going forward as member states begin to, this most recent decision has advised the President of the General Assembly to appoint co-facilitators for the negotiation of the Pact for the Future, to appoint coordinators for each of the 5 chapters. So one could say, yes, it's going to be complicated, but the UN is complicated. The SDGs are complicated. So, we need to kind of continue the conversation within the context of these decisions made. Finally, I would say that C4UN, we've been in conversation with the Department of Global Communications, with the German Foreign Ministry about the possibility of organizing a major CSO conference focusing on developing civil society advocacy for the Summit of the Future at a conference in Nairobi, perhaps the first week of May. So that's still in development. If the funding is obtained, stay tuned. Thanks.
Thanks. I think all this is really interesting, and thanks very much. Finally, I got some idea about what is the summit, and I think many of us here, but many of us are from the margins, indigenous or communities discriminated in work and dissent, Dalits, how can we be part of these conversations? Is there space for civil society? How can we be at the table? Even these chapters you're talking about, how can we bring our voice into these chapters? Anybody has any other questions for Jeffrey? Then, okay.
Well, let me just offer a further context regarding the role of civil society in the negotiations of this pact for the future. And so there was a so-called modalities resolution that was actually passed last fall about the summit that gave the major groups and other stakeholders a mandated role. In other words, we have a seat at the table in the preparations of the Summit of the Future and at the summit itself. Now, as you would expect, we have been engaged in conversation with some of the members of the MGOS, shall we say. But, I think we're all well aware the main focus has been on the SDG Summit. And also, let's be honest, there are some major groups who are serious critics of Our Common Agenda and of the Summit of the Future. And I would say civil society is an independent civil society platform. It's all about interrogating, these proposals. So we welcome critique, right? I mean, we welcome dissent. We're members of civil society ourselves. So, we want to acknowledge and provide a platform for these conversations to take place. But now that the SDG Summit is upon us, before you know it, it's going to be in the rearview mirror, and people are going to begin to ask themselves, well, what do we do next? And we, as the Coalition for the UN We Need, we want to ensure that civil society's voice and your voices are heard in the negotiations and in the conversations, not just in the quarters of the UN, but globally, right? There needs to be conversations at, at the regional level with regional commissions, certainly at the country level as well. So, we'll see how we can shape this, right? And, we all know, we've all had conversations about how the restrictions of civic space, both domestically, you're very painfully aware of that at the national level, but also here at the UN. So we're just now beginning the conversation with the major groups and other stakeholders, I would say. I think now there's finally space, I would almost say for some reluctantly. They're like, some people say this is a distraction, a dangerous distraction. Well, whatever you call it, it's happening. So, it's really up to us to seize the moment and then shape it to the best of our ability to fit, our vision for the future we want. So,
thanks so much. That's very helpful. Big round of applause for Jeffrey. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. So I'd now go to get from Versalini. Sorry, Versalini is actually, she's part of the committee that advises the president of Brazil on inclusion and other aspects of the minorities. She's also part of the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated in Work and Dissent. So okay, yeah, both of you can come maybe here. And then I would request Alion, and then we come to Pradeep, and then we can open the floor.
Obrigada, Bina.
So thank you very much.
Eu sou Versilene Dias, sou de comunidade quilombola no Brasil, pertenço à comunidade Calunga, que é um dos maiores territórios de comunidades quilombolas.
So I'm Versilene, thank you very much. I'm from a Quilombola community, one of the biggest of Brazil. The name is Calunga.
E atualmente eu coordeno a assessoria jurídica da CONAC, que é a Coordenação Nacional de Articulação das Comunidades Negras Rurais Quilombolas no Brasil.
So, and now I'm the representative of the National Coordination of Black Quilombola Communities in Brazil.
Que é uma organização que representa todas as comunidades quilombolas, né? E que são os quilombolas? Os quilombolas são comunidades negras que se constituíram ainda no processo de colonização do Brasil, ou seja, são comunidades que descenderam de pessoas negras que foram escravizadas no país e resistiram ao processo de escravização.
So the Quilombolas, they were enslaved. So it's a community that was created in pre-colonialism. So they ran away from the farms and then they created those territories.
E no Brasil, uma das grandes questões enfrentadas pelas comunidades quilombolas é justamente a regularização dos seus territórios. Essas comunidades.
So one of the biggest issues that the Quilombola communities face today is about land, the ownership of the land.
Porque essas comunidades elas têm uma relação muito específica no seu processo de constituição com o território, ou seja, com o lugar onde elas vivem, que elas consideram e utilizam os recursos naturais para a sua sobreexistência, né, de forma sustentável.
So those communities, they have a very deep connection with the land because they use the natural resources they have for survival.
E por isso há uma necessidade muito grande dessas comunidades que os governos, né, regularizam o território para que elas possam ter acesso livre aos recursos existentes no territórios que elas ocupam e já.
So it's very important that the governments, they take care of this ownership of the land because they really need this to survive.
Porque sem o território está sujeitas, né, à extinção. E é as comunidades que exercem um papel muito importante dentro dos territórios, que é justamente a preservação do meio ambiente, da biodiversidade, da sociodiversidade, né? Porque o território não é só a terra, mas todos os seres que estão ali.
And the Quilombola communities, they take care of the development and sustainability of the territory. So they have this deep connection with nature and all the biodiversity that is inside. So it's not only about the people, it's about all the issues related to the land.
E apesar de ter na Constituição brasileira o reconhecimento do direito ao território, que o Estado brasileiro deve titular os territórios quilombolas, isso na prática não é efetivado.
So we have some laws talking about the Quilombola and the land. So, but we don't see the reinforcement of the law inside our communities. So we have, oops.
Até perdi o meu rumo da fala. Que surdo. Onde eu estava mesmo?
Porque tem leis, mas elas não são efetivas.
E você já traduziu, né?
Já. Pode finalizar.
Sorry. E já deu 3 horas?
Não, tem 25 minutos ainda. Acho que finaliza para ele poder falar.
Finalizando, Ali. E acho que é um pouco disso, né?
So it's about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Now I'll go to Alyon, who is the UN Advocacy Officer for the Inclusivity Project, and also from the Haratin community, who's part of the Communities Discriminated on Work and Descent from Mauritania. Alyon.
Thank you, Bina. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for this space. My name is Alioune Mzerik. I am originally from Mauritania, and I belong to the Haratin community. Maybe some of you, it's your first time to hear about this community. And Haratin are the descendant of slave. You can say former slave in Mauritania. They have been enslaved pre and post-colonial. Enslaved when the uh, Islam and Arab colonized Africa. And after the Islam and Arab left and the European came also, we have been facing like intergeneration that slavery, and it's going on until now. The problem just in terms of the constitution, we are not, we don't exist in Mauritania in law. They don't say Haratin, but they recognize the slavery. They say, okay, we have law that criminalizes slavery. We have 5 special courses specialized in trial of perpetrator if you are enslaving someone, so we can go and complain about it. But all of that just for the international consume. No one were like imprisoned since 1990. All funds that have been the international community given to the Mauritania, it goes to the general and colonel and government members' pockets. We are the 45 or up to 45% of the entire population in Mauritania. We are majority, and the minority that is in power are the Arab and Berber people. So as my colleague Versalini was mentioned about the land problem, we are facing the same problem. We are generally cultivator. We do the agriculture, but since Mauritanian has its independence 1960, they said in the preamble of our constitution, all citizens are equal, but in the ground we are not equal. In a paper, all the tribes, they have access to land, but when we go to the technical stuff, it's just the chief of tribe that he owned the land, and we are a part of not a part of tribe, but we are object, some object. So of course we cannot get access to land. For human rights, that's disaster. Just 2 days ago, one from Haratin, he is Senegalese. He has Senegal citizenship, but just criticizing the government. Senegal police extradite him to Mauritania, handcuffed and gave him to Mauritanian police, and no one know where he is now. Like everybody is talking, or you disappear, but police gave that to Mauritanian. Last year, one activist, his name is Alwin. He was in Angola. He's married to Angola's lady. He has kids and everything, but he was also brought from Angola into Mauritanian airport. And until now, he's in jail. So even talking, you cannot even criticize. The last thing that our government did is enact a law that criminalize anyone that critique the government. They say, oh, those are the symbol of the countries. You cannot say any word against the ministers or high officers in police or criminal or general or any one of these. Lastly, I am optimist because we have a dynamic civil society, especially Haratin community. We have a large movement, but we need more mobilization. We need also the people to shed light on our problem because we don't have support from outside. We don't have many educated people. Most of us are illiterate, like they don't go to school. Girls are married before 15 or 14 years old. Soldiers, Haratin, if they go to retirement, of course, they go straight to the private security to be security guard after 60 or 40 years of service. So basically, I'm optimist, but I know we have, we have many things that we have to work on, and I believe one day we will arrive. Thank you.
So quickly, Pradeep, thank you very much, Elion. Pradeep is heading the Dalit Lives Matter International and looking at Dalit youth and issues of youth. So if you can come in 2 minutes. Yeah, and then I'll come back to Robbie. Yes.
Pradeep can share more about what strategies for these communities will be useful. Yeah, then I think that will help.
Sure. Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bina. I'm Pradeep from Nepal, and I represent Dalit Lives Matter. First, I'll share my realization. So last 15 years, I used to work with the young people and work for the youth policy and all. So when I was sitting in the UN, and then realized that when we talk about the youth, so we thought everyone fit in the youth community. So yesterday, last 15 years, there's a lot of achievement, especially on youth sector. So I'll give a few examples. So I involved to make national youth policy as well as global policy. So we made the Youth Peace Security Resolution, and we also proposed within the United Nations, UN Youth Envoy for General Secretary, and that's happened. And I'm one of the proposers to establish United Nations Youth Office. So that's also happened. But when I realized yesterday, so when we talk about the youth, we only talk about the some youth who can represent there. And right now, we are talking about those young people who are not representative, especially from community, from discriminated based on the work and descent and Dalit. So that's one thing, my realization. Second thing, how can we go ahead? That's the Paul question. So first of all, CDWD communities need to realize youth is an important part of this process. So half of the world population is under 30. So 8 billion population, if we talk about the 4 billion people are young people. Those people can be the change maker. So first of all, CDWD communities need to think these young people will be the leader now, and they will be leader for next few years. And they can be the communicator for all this process. We need to think in that way. Another way, we need to think they can innovate. So they can be an innovator. So let's think in that way. Third is they are change maker. They can involve as a change maker. So let's involve them as a change maker. Last, they can also think that now there's a lot of digital connectivity. Also, there is a digital divide. So they can work for as a connector for the community. These 5 things, if we can understand from the CWD community leader to engage the young people, we can achieve SDGs, and we can really meaningful leaving no one behind. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pradeep, for keeping it short. I'll come back to Robbie, and then we can open the floor for maybe 10 minutes after Robbie speaks. And then before the next announcement comes, we have to be out of this room. So I'm conscious of that. Yes.
I thought it was an emergency. No, but what can be done, even with the gains? Well, for indigenous peoples, the work on the ground needs to continue and needs to be strengthened. So for example, when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in the Asia region, what we immediately did was to have all this simplified and translated into indigenous languages, not in national languages only, but into indigenous languages, to make sure that indigenous peoples know the obligations of their governments, their commitments, the commitments that they did at the global level. The other aspect also that we continue working on is on strengthening our capacities in terms of negotiations, advocacy. How do we deal with all these, because we're not only dealing with governments, we're also dealing with corporations coming into our territories, wanting to utilize our resources. And we will only be able to negotiate effectively, advocate effectively, if we have the information simplified and in a manner and form that we understand, and we also have the support from the civil society and from other organizations into putting our concerns forward with these governments and corporations. The third one is on continuing on strengthening movements, because as I've been mentioning, it's only in unity that we can achieve something. And governments know that, corporations know that. So what they do is the divide and rule tactics. They have so many strategies and tactics to divide us, even among ourselves, those that they cluster in the LNOB or left behind from the development. No? They will do everything to divide us, but it's very important that we are united as a movement. And we continue strengthening that. The third is on building solidarity. Now, the war in Ukraine is a big issue. But what we don't know is that indigenous peoples in rural communities in Russia are the ones being drafted as soldiers by the government of Russia, and they're the ones fighting a war that they don't want. We're condemning Russia, but we don't know that the people behind there putting in the front lines in the war are indigenous peoples coming from communities. So it's important that we understand the struggles of each and we build solidarity, understand the issues that each and every one of us are facing. Because at the end of the day, we can only achieve something really, and we can only topple all these status quo if we really come together. And the last point that I want to make is to be firm and assert the development that we want. For indigenous peoples, we know the development that we want for our communities, and that should be the one that should be pushed in this our common agenda for development. No, it's not the development that they want, it's the development that we want that should be pushed in the Summit of the Future, all these summits that will be conducted. And we have to be united in what we want to push for this one. Thank you.
Thanks, Robbie.
Yeah, thank you so much. Shall I? Okay. Yeah, I want to go back to the baseline discussions that we had, and also would like to take up what Paul has mentioned regarding the strategy building. What next now? So considering this SDG meeting and its relations with other treaty, like other international legal mechanism where United Nations is a depository, being a student of international law, and I work on human rights, and then I've been working with the treaty bodies and writing the state report and providing, like working the civil societies, working on the women's issue, Dalit issue together with my colleague. So in terms of achievement, the legal achievement, the normative framework, the kind of mechanism that we have in paper, we have achieved a lot when I talk about my own country context. But whether these available legal mechanisms that exist in paper are serving or are they catering the needs of the people or not? So that's a big question. So in terms of the principle of equality, the principle of non-discriminations for the citizens or the people living in certain territory, that has been quite contested from the time and again. And the commitments are there on the international forum, the global forum. So when you go and see our government delegations, the tomorrow and the day after, you would hear a lot of things that has been documented, and it has been submitted to the different platforms. But then we are asking the same questions, whether it has been effectively corroborated at the local level, whether the SDGs has been localized effectively or not. That's a big question, and we'll continue dealing with that. So now, the building strategy, because as a student of international legal mechanism, what I see is limitation. How our government views the commitment and its obligations. So when we talk about this Sustainable Development Goal, Millennium Development Goal, and other thing, it has always a coherence with the widely ratified treaties. So be it with the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, CEDAW, it has its nexus with the articles mentioned over there. So what I would suggest is, while building the strategy, like if we do not see our scope, trying to focus on advocacy that would lead to the awareness, and eventually it will lead to the action. So I always focus on 3 A's: advocacy, awareness, that would lead to the action. And in terms of, sure. So, yeah, so, okay, yeah, I'm done here.
Anyone else would like to? Yes, Johanna, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm Johannes. I'm the advocacy officer for the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated in Work and Dissent. I want to make some practical points because I think strategy is really important, but how do we implement it? So when we all talk to missions or make submissions to certain mechanisms for human rights, like the Universal Periodic Review and so on, what I would suggest is that when we want to ensure that civil society is included, for example, in the political declaration, as happened this year, very difficult process with the different countries that have inputs, have certain objections and so on, that we don't only focus on our own community and we don't insist on naming necessarily them in the political declaration outcome statement of the summit or of the HLPF normally. Because what this leads to is a competition for naming everyone. So not only indigenous, CDWD, LGBTI, older persons, women and children, and so on. And I think it's about saying marginalized communities, to take those into account. Because if we start about playing the inclusion game, to name all the communities in the final outcome declaration, that becomes kind of a competition that we don't want to be part of. We want to show solidarity also, that all of them are mentioned. And that's something I think we have also learned from some of the conversations with the LGBT movement, that they have also this approach that to talk about marginalized communities in general, at least in the final outcome declaration. Apart from that, obviously, there are different other processes that we need to ensure that there are declarations and resolutions for all of these communities in place that are separate from, let's say, these outcome declarations. But that's kind of a little bit of a different fight as I see it. So let's show solidarity by ensuring that we don't talk only about our own, but mention marginalized communities in that process. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some slight difference of opinion here, because identity-based groups always want to be mentioned. So we cannot go under the larger marginalization. I'll also ask, sorry, Robbie to respond as well. I think they will also, because we're fighting for identity. So we cannot go under the larger marginalization. I think that we're very clear about that. So there is some slight difference. I'll request Robbie also.
That has been, I think, an issue raised to us, indigenous peoples, because in the political declaration, they just wanted to have that phrase on those left behind must be empowered, and not to list down everybody. What we were fighting for was not listing. Let's be clear on that. We were not fighting for us to, when we said that we want reference on indigenous peoples, it's not just to list us down. When we said that we wanted reference on indigenous peoples, it's reference on indigenous peoples recognizing our rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So clustering us into just one marginalized communities, or just saying that these marginalized communities, their concerns must be addressed, is also the legitimizing the struggles that we have. No, let's be let's not join the governments into this clustering that they're doing of all these struggles of the people. No, that's the easy way out for them, to cluster everyone. These are marginalized, these are vulnerable communities, without really looking at the specifics. Workers, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, women, youth, elders have different specific needs and priorities that needs to be addressed in the development agenda. And clustering everyone in marginalized or vulnerable groups will not address these historical injustices.
Thanks, Robbie. I think well said. Just to give you an example, in India, we always have this word universalization. So any policy they say, it's universalization. Everybody will get it. Everybody will get it. But the point is, yeah, one size fits all. But the point is that the people who are farthest left behind will not have access, even if we say it's a universal policy. We have to have specific, like for a like when they were vaccine were given, they had to take vaccine to the people who are disabled because they couldn't come to the center. So unless we have those kind of specific mechanisms and we name it specifically, that's the fight that has been there for years and years. So we can have more discussions internally about that. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but yeah. But yeah, maybe I'll just close with one. I understand that, there are so many differences between us, but we are all here together at the UN because we come here in hope of, whatever you can call it, convention, you can call it summit. But we're also here specifically from the communities discriminated in work and dissent because we want global solidarity. And I think that is where people who are not part of the community, we are asking for and we are requesting that global solidarity. How can we be involved in the Summit of Future? How can we put in the issues of DWD in that? How can we be in solidarity with the indigenous peoples? So I think that is where we are here today. We are also pushing for a resolution on the communities discriminated in work and dissent, and then eventually demanding a declaration. So in that process, or a convention, yes, even better. In that process, I'd request all of you to be part of this campaign and support us and give us that global solidarity. With that, I say Jai Bhim.